Welcome, and thank you for joining us at the table. I'm Thomas Dodderwick, and today we have as our guest Father Ryan Erlenbush, who is the pastor at Corpus Christi here in Great Falls, and is also a priest of the Priest Council for the bishop here in the Diocese of Great Falls-Billings, and serves as a representative to the discipleship committee in our diocese. Welcome, Father. Thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. Happy to be with you, Thomas.
We're going to talk a little bit today about this Eucharistic revival. We heard a big push of that in June of last year, of 2022. And since then, some people may have thought, well, that was a June 2022 kind of big push from the USCCB, but actually it's still ongoing for another 3 years, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. That's right. It's a 3-year Eucharistic revival, and it's broken into 3 phases, is probably the most helpful way to think of it. And those phases roughly begin and end with the Feast of Corpus Christi, the body and blood of Christ, each year in June. For the most part, that's how they're organized. But so we have the diocesan phase, which is what we are still in now. And so on the diocesan level, the different dioceses throughout the country are promoting the Eucharistic revival. And that's maybe why some people are saying, well, what's happening at my parish? We haven't done anything at my parish.
Right.
Well, next year is the parish level. So right now, the dioceses and our diocese as well, our bishops, are helping to equip the priests to be able to next year move forward on a parish level for promoting the Eucharistic revival, which is just a greater love for our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament, and to have a great reverence and recognition of his real presence, and also, of course, a love for the Mass, but then also living a Eucharistic life that is meant to flow from a life of giving of ourselves to others and all of that. And then finally, the 3rd year is called the Year of Mission, and it's more of on a nationwide aspect of sharing the faith that we have in this great gift of the Eucharist with the whole world.
You touched on it briefly there. This revival isn't just about the true presence in the Eucharist, but it's about being a Eucharistic people even beyond, not diminishing the real presence, of course, but it's really about helping us identify ourselves as Eucharistic people in a Eucharistic community, right?
Yes, exactly. When we recognize Jesus is really and truly present in the Blessed Sacrament, that should lead us to then change our lives to imitate him. We think of how the beautiful saying is when, from the Old Testament, we're told when you come to a table for a meal, be careful to notice what is given. And then as we're here at the table, notice what is given, because you're expected to do likewise. And the fathers of the Church reflect on that and say, when we come to the Eucharistic feast at Holy Mass, we're then called to do likewise. As Christ gave himself entirely for us, then we should live for others. And of course, you can think of St. Ignatius of Antioch as probably the early, great example from the very early church. He knew he was living during the time of the apostles that early on, and he talks about how he wants his whole life to be a Eucharistic life. His whole life would be modeled upon the sacrifice that Christ made, that he also would, and he did die for his people as a bishop. He gave his life for his people. Yeah.
And we're moved from the table. But an interesting thing about the Eucharist is we're also drawn to, all of our life is focused towards that very thing that we're driven, we're charged as we go from, right? Yeah. And even the other sacraments kind of lead and point to the Eucharist. And so how do the other sacraments play into it? Because we hear that in the catechism and in just our theological thought, that the sacraments and our whole life, the source and summit is the Eucharist. So how is that true that we are both going to and coming from the same point?
That is right, yeah. The source and summit is the great line. The Eucharist is the source and summit of the entire Christian life. And probably the easiest sacrament to see would be on the daily experience of the Christian, that our daily Catholic life is confession. And a big part of the Eucharistic revival is promoting sacrament of reconciliation and the benefit of frequent confession to then have more fruitful communion. And there's, of course, one aspect of that is the being prepared to worthily receive our Lord in the Eucharist. And certainly this is an aspect of what the bishops are concerned about and why they're promoting the Eucharistic revival. But another way of looking at that too is to say, through regular confession, we're able to ask, is my life really patterned on the example I have that Christ gave me in the Eucharist? So not only am I worthy to receive him, but am I living a life that, similar to, modeled upon what he himself lived? And that's where I think the frequent confession can really, if we see it not simply as, usually we think of confession as a negative reality, getting rid of sin, which is important, of course, but also it has this positive side of moving me forward in virtue, helping me to conform my life more to Christ. And if we approach the sacrament that way, we'd see that it really does flow from the Eucharist, leads us back to the Eucharist, conforming our lives that what we might call Eucharistic coherence. There's something that our life is really modeled on the sacrifice we see. And then, of course, you think of all the other sacraments with, of course, baptism. Even in the rite of baptism, it speaks of how this child will one day come to the altar to receive our Lord in Holy Communion. And confirmation, of course, in our own diocese, we have the Restored Order, which is by far, I just want to go on the record to say that's the way it should be. It's so good that we have it that way. If you go back to the 1200s, St. Thomas Aquinas is assuming that everyone's receiving confirmation about the same time or just before receiving First Communion. So that's really the best way to do it. And we see then how that confirmation is then preparing the soul for the food of adults, which is the Eucharist.
Speaking a little bit about the secondary focus of the Eucharistic Revival being reconciliation in the sacrament. In my opinion, it's one of the most underused sacraments of our laity, of course, and maybe even some of our priests even underuse it. A big part of the reason it's not that it's not used is kind of a fear of it almost. What would you say to somebody who's afraid of that sacrament?
One thing that I think helps is to remember that the priest also goes to confession. In fact, in the old days, back before the Second Vatican Council, it was actually required for priests to go to confession every week. Now, of course, out in mission territory, I don't know how feasible that was,
right.
But and it's not that, because priests are so bad, but just the idea of how fruitful it is for helping us grow in our spiritual life. And so seeing it really in that positive way. And so if we remember, the priest also goes to confession. He's also a human being. He's not going to be shocked or surprised or horrified or anything like that. Really, we are just so happy to be able to offer confession. And we ourselves, I myself, benefit from confession as well. So we see how good that sacrament can be. So that maybe helps to take some of that fear. And as I say, thinking of it of not only that I want my sins to be forgiven, but what are the positive things I can do to grow in holiness, to actually live more the life that Christ wants for me?
Confession's more than just me going in and telling my sins and the priest saying, okay, you're forgiven, right? I mean, it's not a counseling session, but yet the priest does kind of help you address maybe some of the roots as to what's dividing you or keeping you from Christ, right?
Absolutely. I think confession is a great time to ask a simple question or two about how to grow in the spiritual life. It's true, it's not a counseling session, but we do receive some counsel at confession. The priest is instructed to give some advice. And it's okay, sometimes the priest doesn't really need to give much advice. A person might not. Sometimes we kind of know what we need to do, and just the grace of the sacrament helps us to do it. But oftentimes the priest will give some advice, and that can help us to move forward. And if you have a question about the faith or a question about your own spiritual life, what maybe should I do? Confession's a great time to look for that. It is true, if there's a real long line, of course, the priest might not be able to take as much time as he would like. But even if there is a line, I tell people it is okay if you have a simple question, definitely ask and look for that counsel to be able to move forward. Yeah.
Going back now to the bigger picture of the Eucharistic Revival, you spoke about the national movements and the plan of what the national movement is doing through the USCCB. Let's talk just briefly about what we're doing here in our own diocese during this diocesan year and what we're headed towards. We have a big event coming in May. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right, yeah. So in May, it's very exciting down in Billings, and there's still time to get tickets if you haven't gotten tickets yet to attend the event. Dr. Scott Hahn is the keynote, the main speaker. This is May 5th and 6th is the days there. It's the Friday and Saturday. As Dr. Scott Hahn will be down in Billings, and then also Great Joy Archbishop Sample from Portland will be here as well, and then some of the priests from the diocese will be there as well to assist, and of course the bishops will be there. And this sort of weekend conference, it's Friday and then all day Saturday, will culminate in a big Eucharistic procession, and also then the Holy Mass, of course, as well, and be an excellent opportunity for families. It's really geared towards families. It's not just simply for adults. We have things for the kids as well, to just have a real renewal of our love of our Lord, and an awareness of what a great gift the Eucharist is, and the real joy joining your fellow Catholics in your diocese. And so it'd be a great opportunity.
You mentioned that we will kind of culminate with Mass, and right before Mass, we're going to have a Eucharistic procession. I know you do a lot of processions at your parish at Corpus Christi. Mm-hmm. Why are those processions important? What do they do? What's the big deal?
The practice of having a Eucharistic procession is, many parishes have a Eucharistic procession for the feast of Corpus Christi, or the feast of the body and blood of Christ. And in fact, this last year, many parishes within our diocese started that practice up again. If they maybe hadn't done it for a while, they were encouraged, and yes, let's do that again. And then this coming year, even more, we'll be doing that. And the idea of the Eucharistic procession is probably twofold. On the one hand, it's that public statement of our belief that Jesus is really present here in the Eucharist. This is not ordinary bread. And the way we show that is the massive procession. We're all out there on the streets in front of the whole world. And what a joy that we live in a country where we can do that. And it's still free.
That's
and
right.
In many parts of the world, you think in places in Africa or parts of the Middle East where Catholics would not be able to have a Eucharistic procession. So what a great joy that we're able to do that in this part of the world, in our own nation. So it's that public witness and testimony to our belief that our Lord is truly in the Eucharist. But then the second part of a procession is more interior for us, more to help us grow in our own life of holiness. And that is that we go out of the church in the procession, and the Eucharist generally leads. And the idea is we're going through the world led by Christ, and then we come back into the church, which is to symbolize he's leading us now into heaven. So it's this idea of I'm following my Lord, and this is again conforming my life to model upon his. I'm walking in the way that he walked around, and then I come back into the church in the same way that he'll lead me to the joy of heaven.
Sure. Always with our eyes focused on him,
Yes.
wherever he's leading us.
Right. And singing hymns the whole way too.
It's a beautiful time. If you've never experienced a procession, it really is a beautiful experience. And one of our ancient traditions that I do wish we would have a little bit more of.
Yes.
Because it really does. It's a whole body experience of following Christ through the world.
Yes, indeed. And it's great too that the whole person is engaged in this. We're moving, we're walking, we're singing, our hearts are united with the Lord. So the whole person engaged.
Even our children.
Even
the little ones, they love getting out and about.
Yes, indeed. And sometimes the kids will throw the flowers for the big feast, and it's a wonderful thing. Yes, indeed.
Father, I cannot thank you enough for taking time today to talk about the National Eucharistic Revival and all of the national events that are in the works, but especially our local one here on May 5th and 6th.
Absolutely happy to be here.